Right. The aim of this recording is to briefly introduce you to some of the most important concepts behind the hair tissue mineral analysis. You are made up of trillions of cells, and all those cells have different functions: brain cells, organ cells, muscle, kidney, liver, digestive cells. But what they all have in common is that your body has to somehow turn the food you eat, the air you breathe, and the water you drink into cellular energy. So what we're going to be able to look at a hair test is how well your body is doing that. We're going to be able to look at some of the components, i.e. the energy regulating glands, the adrenal and the thyroid, and we're going to get a sense of where that energy is going and how balanced it is. How much is going into rest and digest, and how much is going into fight and flight and activity. In simple terms, the minerals regulate all of this at the cellular level. So we get an insight into energy production and stress response at the cellular level. Energy in terms of metabolism, and what we're going to have an idea of at the end of the day is your metabolic health, how well you generate energy within your body. This is a hair tissue mineral analysis from Analytical Research Labs. The levels, as you're seeing them at the moment, are at their optimal ranges. At the top of the chart, you will see your name, sex, age, the date the sample arrived at the lab, and your lab number. Lab number is good to get 20% off the Endomet supplements if that's the way you choose to go. This top graph and the bottom graph relates to the nutrient minerals. So these are minerals that we know play a healthy role in the body. However, this chart does not give you insight necessarily into excesses or deficiencies. High levels can mean an elimination of a toxic form of these minerals. It can also mean that the body has built up a certain amount of these minerals in some tissue, but not other tissues. And it can also mean that that mineral is being lost from the body, even if it is already deficient due to a certain state of biochemistry, i.e., a stress state. You'll see at the bottom some of the most important ratios. Ratios are relationships between minerals. You can also see that relationship on the top chart. The top chart is set up in such a way that if the minerals are level as you're visually seeing it, so take calcium and magnesium, top chart on the left hand side. If calcium is 40 and magnesium is 6, or a similar ratio, i.e., the levels are equal whether you go up or down, then those minerals are in a ideal relationship. That ideal relationship is reflected at the bottom, where you can see the very top one says Ca/Mg with a relationship of 6.67. That's what you get when the levels at the top are equal. The bottom ratios are some of the most important. The next graph shows you the heavy metals at the left-hand side. So these are the toxic metals that we know, or should I say, that do not play a healthy role in the body as far as we know, and actually can clog up the system. The thing about toxic metals is that they can often replace some of the nutrient minerals, either if the nutrient minerals are deficient, or if there's not enough nutrient minerals to stop the toxicity getting in. It takes a lot less toxicity to start to get in the body than it does nutrient minerals to get in the body. And that's due to the makeup of the toxic heavy metals. You will always have toxicity in the body, and therefore there is an optimal range. The optimal range indicates that you are getting out any average exposed toxicity. Anything above that indicates that you've been exposed to higher levels. Anything below that tends to indicate that the metal is accumulating because your body's not strong enough to eliminate it. At the right hand side are the additional minerals. These are minerals that do play a role or can play a role in the body, but in terms of nickel, we know it can be incredibly toxic. So it tends to more reflect the toxicity of nickel. And cobalt, molybdenum, and lithium all play roles in the body, but in terms of their how that reflects on the hair test is to this present unknown. Now, to simplify this hair test, we're going to concentrate on the four main minerals related to your metabolic health. That is calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. These are the main minerals that we tune into during a hair test, and they give us the best insight. And I'm going to break this down further for you. The balance between sodium and potassium gives us an insight into the adaptive nature of energy. By adaptive nature, what we mean is the body's ability to adapt to a situation. So it's different to digestive energy, or it's different to mechanical muscular energy. It's the energy for you to adapt to situations. The energy to think differently, to see things differently, to move differently, to heal the body, to change your patterns and the way you live at the present moment of time. This is why I focus on this ratio more than any others. When the ratio is good or slightly elevated, and I mean slightly elevated, then it's within the healthy range, and it indicates increasing energy production, moving forward in life, a higher electrical charge of the cell, and generally more strength and more power to the individual. What it relates to is the balance between sodium and potassium at the cellular level. Sodium tends to accumulate outside the cell, potassium accumulates inside the cell. This is due to the sodium-potassium pumps, which are numerous on the outside of every cell. The pump pumps out 3 sodiums to 2 potassium atoms, creating an electrical chemical gradient that the body then uses for numerous functions. When the ratio goes low, as it is now, then it's more related to a slowing oxidation rate or a slowing energy production, a reduced electrical charge, and also a catabolic state. It's no longer optimal, so the body is now breaking down. Whatever's happening with the rest of the chart, it will indicate adrenal fatigue, hypothyroidism, glucose intolerance, possible trend towards diabetes and hypoglycemia, stress on the organs such as the kidney and liver, and cardiovascular stress. It tends to be related to more chronic frustration, resentment, and hostility, especially as it goes below 1. Also, hidden trauma. The second ratio we're going to look at is the adrenal ratio. In simple terms, the adrenal glands regulate the amount of fuel available to the cells, and the magnesium-sodium ratio gives us an insight into the cellular response to that adrenal activity. Again, it can be slightly slower response, or it can be slightly faster response. Either's fine as long as it's within a healthy range. The calcium-potassium gives us an insight into thyroid activity, or the cellular response to thyroid activity. What the thyroids do is release thyroid hormone into the bloodstream. That enters into the cell, and that regulates how quickly it burns the fuel, or the metabolic rate. Again, you can have a slower cellular response to thyroid activity, or a slightly faster cellular response to thyroid activity. Either is fine as long as it's mild. Finally, we're getting an insight into the cellular response to blood sugar, or the effect of diet and lifestyle on the cells. Whilst the sodium-potassium ratio gives us an insight into internal stresses, the calcium-magnesium gives us an insight into external stresses. And in this case, beyond the optimal range, anything high or anything low can both mean that there's impaired blood sugar regulation or sugar metabolism issues. So that's the major metabolic patterns that we focus on. And in simple terms, what you're looking for is a 2 up, 2 down pattern. When calcium and magnesium are slightly higher and sodium and potassium are slightly lower, that's a slower cellular response. So that's more parasympathetic. That's more rest and digest. That's more healing, rebuilding. That's chilling out. That's when you're not active, but your body's still very active, detoxifying, eliminating, rebuilding, fixing. So the energy is going into health maintenance, repairing, processing, learning, growing. When you see the opposite, then that's more active state. So the energy is now going more into the sympathetic system, more into the muscles, more into the brain for activity, for responding to things, maybe going to work, going outside, doing jobs. It's a more active state of energy. But again, as long as it's mild, it's healthy stresses on the body and the body can cope. And throughout the day, you will shift between the two states: rest and digest, sympathetic; more active, more sympathetic. Now, what happens if we require more energy than what we can healthily give within that range? Well, what you start to see then is what we know as a stress response. You can simplify this. You can simply say a stress response is unhealthy demands for energy on the body, for you to do things, for you to mentally think, for you to mentally move. If you bring it down to the physical level, the demands of energy production is stressful on the body. So what you see here is sodium goes incredibly high, higher than potassium. Now this is where the strength and the power of a stress response comes from. It's associated with acute anger, acute rage, feelings of stress, pain in the body, liver and kidney stress, and inflammation. You'll also see that the sodium is significantly higher than the magnesium, so that's a very fast cellular response to adrenal activity. So that's more associated with aggression, with anger, with rage, or maybe anxiety, irritation, nervousness, shorter temper. Symptoms will improve things like ADD, ADHD, hyperactivity, severe allergic responses, acute stress, inflammation, pain, muscle cramps, general body temperature, tension. What's basically happening is that you've got a significant increase in blood sugar levels, insulin levels, and blood pressure levels. Obviously, those symptoms depend on the intensity of the stress and also the duration of the stress. You'll also see that potassium is significantly higher than calcium. So that's a fast cellular response to thyroid activity. So again, there's going to be more feelings of irritation, anxiety, extreme nervousness. You're going to get easily fatigued because you're burning through your fuel and your resources, and you're burning through to nothing. There'll be trouble sleeping because of the stress state, excessive hunger, excessive thirst, heart palpitations, tachycardia. When you've been through a stress state, the whole point of this is to overcome the stress. So at some point, you want to go into a more parasympathetic healing state. Calcium and magnesium go high, sodium and potassium go low. You're now more into rest and digest. Hopefully the body recovers, and then you get more back into the normal patterns of low energy, higher energy, fight or flight, back into rest and digest and sleep, and back into more activity. That's the whole point. So that nicely brings us on to the stress analysis. Basically, stress on the body is a manipulation of the energy production, as we've now introduced you to. So if we go back to that original stress response and examine it slightly deeper, the sodium-potassium ratio gives us a really good insight into what's called the stage of stress. At this stage of stress, you have a lot of power and a lot of strength when sodium is higher than potassium, and you've got sodium higher magnesium, potassium higher than calcium. It's called either the acute or the alarm stage of stress, in which the body has adequate energy to fight back against whatever the stress is. Now, the stress could be dietary, could be something going on in the digestive system. It could be deficiencies. It could be lifestyle, love, relationships, occupation, hobbies. It could be traumas that are happening to you, car accidents, bike accidents, emotional traumas. It could be infections. It could be toxicity. Whatever stresses is, this is the initial stages when your body is fighting back and you've got the most power available. As we said, you're going to have fast cellular response to both adrenal and thyroid activity and a high sodium potassium ratio. Now, what's going to happen over time if you don't address those stresses is the body's going to start to weaken. So, for example, the sodium potassium ratio might come lower, somewhere between 2 and 5. When it starts to do this, you're losing power, you're losing strength. You no longer have the strength and the energy to overcome the stress. So now you're in what's called the resistant stage of stress. This is when you have lower energy, you cannot get rid of the stress. So what you do instead is try to contain the stress, push it out the way, suppress it, hide it. You're in a constant battle as the stress tries to take control and you try to suppress it. Now, this pattern can occur, or this stage of stress can occur over many, many different patterns. You can see the blood sugar start to become imbalanced and calcium and magnesium ratio start to become more extreme. You can start to see sodium and potassium start to drop. Now, whilst that might look balanced, there's a few things that give away those other problems. So we haven't got the normal 2 up, 2 down. We've got 3 below. We've also got a low sodium potassium ratio. So there's things that jump out that tell us that that's not a balanced state. As sodium and potassium come down, you require sodium and potassium to keep calcium and magnesium and other minerals in solution in the bloodstream. So as soon as those two start to come down, which will happen as the adrenals and the thyroid weaken, calcium and magnesium will start to precipitate out of the bloodstream and into the tissue. These do not display excess levels of calcium and magnesium. What it displays is a buildup of calcium and magnesium that you cannot use, i.e., it's biounavailable, it's not being kept in its ionic form, building up in the soft tissue. So calcium building up in the joints is arthritis, building up in the kidneys is potential kidney stones. In the liver, maybe gallbladder stones. In the brain, you might experience brain fog. In the cardiovascular system, you might start to develop cardiovascular disease. When both of these build up in the body, it is the aging process. And a lot of people are aging well ahead of their time because of this build-up that's occurring. We can tell it's not a normal pattern of just the body going more parasympathetic because the sodium and the potassium are incredibly low. The low potassium also continues to indicate a fight or flight state within the body. It's just a more exhausted fight or flight state. What's important to realize is that that original pattern you saw for fight or flight when sodium was very high and higher than potassium, and both sodium and potassium were higher than calcium and magnesium, the body's still attempting to do that. So the trigger is still in the body. If the body had the energy, if the body wasn't exhausted, you would still be in that pattern. The only difference between then and now is that the trigger continues to exist, but the body's exhausted and cannot maintain that rate. Now, in reality, we go through life and we layer in stress after stress after stress on these states. So we might go back and forth between those different states, staying in the resistance and then going back into the alarm stage of stress. But there's a difference. It's not quite the same as the first one because there's now an underlying level of exhaustion as indicated by the calcium and magnesium, as well as the stress state indicated by the sodium potassium, until eventually that sodium potassium level starts to fall below 2. That is what we call the exhausted stage of stress. In this stage, the body doesn't have the energy to get over the stress, and it doesn't have the energy to contain the stress. So it goes into what's called a holding pattern. You could call it the fetus pattern, or the fetus position, where the body just tries to protect itself and prevent any further decline of health. You could almost call it a withdrawal from life. And as long as that NAK stays below 2, then that's the state the body will be in, no matter what else the pattern is going on. And often you see further decline with the magnesium levels dropping and the calcium. That's not an improvement, that's actually the body becoming more and more exhausted, and now it hasn't even got the energy to push out those levels onto the hair test. So there's a few things we have to take away from that. First of all, any hair test is a sum of everything that's gone before it. So there'll be some patterns in your body which are still high energy. There'll be some patterns in your body which are total and utter exhaustion. There'll be some patterns in your body which reflect anger or happiness or celebration or breakup or excessive work or workaholic. All these patterns build up in your body and are trying to influence your energy production still, trying to take certain amounts of energy. And what we see on your most recent hair test is the accumulation of all those patterns. The aim of the program is basically retracing. We want to start retracing all those patterns, and as you rid those patterns, there's less and less influence on your energy production, or should I say fewer demands on your energy production, and therefore a lot more available energy for you to use to live and your body to use to maintain itself. The problem is each one of these patterns will require potentially a slightly different diet or a slightly different supplement support. So at the beginning, you might need a lot of amounts of calcium and magnesium, and lower levels of fat in the diet to help support the body to build up the stress buffers so it can cope with the stress again. After that, you might need more B complex, thiamine, glandulars, copper, manganese to help the body get more energy. Now it starts retracing an old stress state. You're not just going to go straight back into balance. You're now going to start to express what is in your body. All the traumas, all the pains, all the stresses you've been through, all the injuries, all the emotional breakups that you've had in your life that haven't been properly processed and let go of. And at each stage, we respond slightly differently to give the body what it needs at that stage to balance out the energy production a bit better. And then that moves us to the next stage. And then that moves us to the next stage. And we just keep responding to the hair charts. And bit by bit, they improve, they retrace the patterns from previous years. And eventually, the aim is to bring you back into a much more balanced state of biochemistry. So that's the aim of the program. That's what we're looking for in your hair analysis. And when you now get your actual analysis, we will take you through your analysis and then we will introduce you to the recommendations. I hope you enjoyed that introduction into hair analysis, and I look forward to any feedback.